Everyone has been feeling the rise in grocery prices lately, but no one's really showing you how to navigate the store or put a list together that fits your budget. And that's what this series is all about. We'll be taking the same exact recipe, in this case spaghetti and meatballs, and shopping for budget-friendly versus more expensive options of the same ingredients and making two versions of the dish to compare side by side. And in our final taste test here, the question isn't simply which one of these tastes better, but more importantly, it's what ingredients make the biggest difference in the flavor of this dish, and are they worth that extra cost, or could you potentially cut them to save some money? So, let's break it down. We aren't going to be adding truffles or gold leaf for the sake of making dishes expensive. I'm talking about the basic choices we all face in the grocery store. $2 versus $7 canned tomatoes, $1 versus $6 spaghetti, $4 per pound versus $9 per pound ground beef, and $1 versus $5 milk. Because these choices week over week add up significantly. And most people assume the more you spend, the better the food will taste. But the reality is that some ingredients may make a huge impact, while others barely matter depending on the dish that is being made. So in order to put together our grocery list, let's talk about the dish, and I'm making a pretty classic Italian-American style meatball. We've got the basics of ground pork, ground beef, breadcrumbs, milk, onion, eggs, spices, and then for the tomato sauce, we're doing a simple seasoned red sauce with a mix of butter and olive oil, red pepper flake, oregano, a little bit of fresh basil, and of course, some salt. And this recipe will be linked down below if you want to check it out. Now, to test our idea, I pulled together a grocery list with our basic items, and I'm going to duplicate it and keep track of a few things. First is the total costs from scratch, so if you had to buy every single item from scratch, how much would it cost? Second is the total cost if you deduct the common pantry item, because part of saving money on individual grocery trips is learning to stock common items. And then third is the biggest price differences for individual ingredients. So like, what has the biggest increase on a recipe basis? For example, I need to use the whole can of tomatoes for this recipe, so I have to spend an extra $4.84. However, these two bottles of olive oils are about $7 difference for the whole bottle, but on a recipe basis, I'm using a very small amount of each, so it's only about 9 cents of difference for the recipe. So let's head to the store and I'll show you what I bought that had significant differences in price. First up, we have the pasta, where I bought a store brand pound of spaghetti for about $1, then a single heritage grain one for $5.98. Next, we have the tomatoes, which I bought some Cento San Marzanos at $6.68 versus just $1.96 for a basic whole peeled tomato. For the ground beef, I bought a $9 80/20 premium ground beef versus some ground chuck that was 25% off because it needed to be sold, so it ended up only being $4.88 per pound. Tomato paste was $3.28 for a tube versus 97 cents for a bigger can. Then for the milk, I went with $4.97 compared to a store brand that was just $1.38 for a quart. Then for the cheese, I got 24-month aged Parmigiano Reggiano as well as the Kraft green jar. Then there are a bunch of other items I got that didn't warrant buying a second version, like there was really only one option for things like panko breadcrumbs, ground pork, I grabbed an onion, and a couple of other things. Okay, so now that I've got all of these groceries, and I do have some shared items, let's look at the overall price breakdown. So first up, if you were to buy every ingredient from scratch in a completely empty kitchen, you had absolutely nothing, the high-end version comes out to $89.94, and the budget version comes out to $55.51. Now, that seems outrageously expensive, obviously, but if you deduct a lot of these common, pantry and fridge items, things like the spices or your salt, obviously you're not buying a whole jar of olive oil and things like that, the price comes down substantially. If you deduct the common pantry staples, you get $46.87 for the high end and $27.30 on the budget end. And I bring that number up because the real cost you end up spending when you decide to cook and go grocery shop for a recipe is likely going to be somewhere in the middle. I mean, you don't always need to buy a whole new bottle of olive oil or milk or a whole new dozen of eggs and things like that. And honestly, I could have made this whole pile way more expensive. I did decide to use shared spices because I could have got like $8 jars of spice versus like $2 jars of spices. I could have used like the $10 thing of salt instead of this, I think like $3 thing of salt.
but I think there are certain ingredients like spices that if you're looking for the best value, you should buy in bulk and refill them because it's gonna give you that same high quality, but just without the exorbitant cost that you get from a lot of those kind of individually, sourced spice jars. That being said, our prices get even lower when we look at how much we need for the actual recipe and the serving size of the dish. For just what I'll need on the recipe, on the high end is $25.85, and on the budget side is $11.46. And if you further break it down into servings, which I think you can easily get 4 really good servings out of this with 2 big meatballs and then about a quarter pound of pasta, it comes out to $6.46 per serving on the high end and $2.87 per serving. And here's a table showing the biggest price increases based on the total dollar amount as well as the percentage increased. Okay, but now here's where things get interesting because I want to ask the question, like, which of these ingredients are going to have the biggest differences in the flavor of our dish? So let's make our meatballs and sauce, do a taste test, then I'm going to meet you back here, and at the end of the video, I'll give you my top 2 ingredients that I would cut if I was trying to save some money, and the top 2 ingredients that I think are worth spending money on to make better tasting spaghetti and meatballs.
For the meatballs, I made them identical with a ½ pound each of the ground beef and ground pork, and you can see that slight difference in color of the beef. Then I added in the egg yolks, which again, you can see the difference in color, the onion, breadcrumbs, parmesan, milk, the spice mix, and the fresh parsley before mixing those up and forming them into our meatballs. And I made 9 fairly large meatballs out of these, and I just placed them onto a baking tray before sliding both trays into the oven at 400 degrees Fahrenheit to roast and cook until about 155 degrees internal. For the 2 sauces, I started by adding butter and olive oil to a pan over medium heat. Then I tossed in some cracked garlic cloves, red pepper flake, and oregano, and then let all of that bloom before tossing in 30 grams of each tomato paste. Once cooked up, I tossed in each canned tomato and lastly a quarter of an onion and let that all simmer down for about an hour. Now, for these sauces, I did use more expensive olive oil, butter, and tomato paste, but by far the most important ingredient here is going to be the canned tomatoes. And I've found that San Marzanos packed in tomato puree have a thicker and slightly sweeter taste compared to a generic whole peeled tomato packed in water.
Okay, so anytime you are making a pasta sauce, spaghetti meatballs, you want to do some final adjustments, and I am already seeing some differences in our sauces. First is the color. The San Marzanos had that deeper dark red. Again, they have tomato puree and stuff in there. These are a little bit more of an orange color. Again, nothing's wrong with this. It's just a sight. Then texture-wise, this one is definitely a little bit thinner compared to the ones that were packed in that tomato puree. And as far as taste goes, I would say a little bit more tomato-y in this one. Both need a little bit of salt for sure. And then what I'm gonna do, like part of this experimentation is like understanding the limitations of your ingredients. So in the beginning, I added equal parts of both of these, but now that I'm actually tasting this product, what I'm gonna do is add some extra tomato paste into this one to kind of thicken it up and maybe give it a little bit of more of that kind of tomato. Feels like pretty acidic right now, whereas this has a little bit more sugar concentrated down in there. So we're gonna stir that in for our final little adjustment. And that should get us a little bit better because again, you gotta understand the limitations of the ingredients you have. They're not gonna be exactly the same, but if you know how to balance them correctly, that's just as valuable if you're not able to get some of these ingredients or you don't wanna buy them. So let's cook up our pasta, serve up our spaghetti and meatballs, and really talk about some of the differences in the final dishes.
Lastly, we have the biggest price difference in a single ingredient, which is the pasta. Now, there can be some slight differences in aroma when you're eating pasta plain, but the biggest difference we're most likely gonna see is in the texture. So let's cook the pasta and assemble our final bowls and see what stands out the most between these. So to assemble, all I did was bring 2 pans over medium heat, then tossed in the partially cooked pasta along with a spoonful of each sauce to continue cooking that pasta right in the pan. Then I added some fresh basil as a finishing touch to each and stirred everything together so that basil slowly starts to impart the aroma. To plate these, I attempted to spin the pasta around the tongs in hopes of plating it nicely, but it worked just okay. Lastly, top it with 2 meatballs from each of the sauce and finish with our cheeses. The green bottle of Parmesan versus some fresh Parmigiano Reggiano. How different will these be? Let's give them a taste.
Okay, so I've been looking forward to this taste test. I am gonna blindfold up, but just so I can kind of focus really on what I'm tasting and feeling. Obviously, we can see there's some slight visual differences here. A little bit of a lighter color, a little bit of a darker color. So let's blindfold up and give these a taste and see like which ingredients are gonna make the biggest impact. Is it the texture of the pasta, the texture of the meatballs, the aromas of anything in there? So let's see what we got. I think I'll start with a pasta bite only. Really good pasta. That basil, the fresh basil obviously is a super nice addition if you're making these at home. Kind of get the, the green cam pre-grated parm. You get that taste kind of right away. You kind of know that that's what it is. But let's go to the meatball. Yeah, I mean, overall, it's solid. I think I would maybe make a couple tweaks, maybe a little bit more, needs like a little bit more sweetness or something like that. But let me kind of compare to this guy over here. Try to get a little pasta. Right away, definitely a difference in the bite of the pasta. It's not chewier in like a bad way, but just a little bit more of the bite, which I feel like you get a lot of times. I've done numerous tests with kind of bronze cut and more expensive pasta, and there is definitely a textural difference right away. And then as far as the sauce goes, I would say too, definitely more kind of fruity, tomatoey, which is really nice. All right, let's see what the meatball's like. All right, meatball. Texture, I would say a little bit more bite. Meatball, very, very good. As far as like taste and aroma goes, I mean, I use the same spices and everything, so they are very similar. I think most people would be pretty surprised how good both of these dishes really are, even though there is like a fairly big difference in the price. The things like butter, the milk, the egg choices, none of that really matters. It's really just a core couple of ingredients that make a big difference. Okay, so let's do a quick summary of the top 2 ingredients that I would recommend saving your money with and the top 2 ingredients that are worth spending on for your spaghetti and meatballs. Okay, so if you were looking to save some money, I think the first 2 ingredients that I would take a look at are the expensive ground beef and then your expensive spaghetti, and here's why. From a flavor perspective, while you might notice a difference in your ground beef if you were eating a plain burger, when there is ground pork, salt, spices, tons of aromatics, and you have the same fat level in your ground beef options, you're just not gonna notice much of a difference other than maybe a slight textural change. You know, I would assume that most Italian restaurants are not using hyper premium like grass-fed, grass-finished, or Wagyu ground beefs for their meatballs. It's probably just not economical to do so, especially from a flavor perspective. That being said, there are other reasons to buy ground beef. You know, maybe you want to get pasture raised, maybe you want to get grass-fed, so feel free to spend your money as you please as always. But from purely just like a flavor perspective, you're not really going to notice much difference here. And it's a similar idea with the spaghetti. From a texture perspective, I would look for the cheapest bronze cut pasta you can find, but I wouldn't go and get something super, super high end like this for your spaghetti and meatballs because, again, the pasta is not really the star of the show here. This may work well in something like aglio e olio where the pasta is a little bit more of a key ingredient, but for spaghetti and meatballs, it's really about the meatballs and the sauce. So other than maybe a slight textural difference, you're just not gonna get much kind of flavor for your money in this case. That being said, the 2 ingredients that I think can significantly upgrade your spaghetti and meatballs quickly are the canned tomatoes and Parmigiano Reggiano. If you've never tried a tomato packed in tomato puree, I would highly recommend looking for these at the store. It just creates that kind of sweeter, more balanced, more tomatoey sauce. Then lastly, we have the Parmigiano Reggiano, which is just a very unique taste compared to, this grated parm. This is aged for like 24 months versus this is kind of made very quickly, and then it's all ground up and grated ahead of time. Now, if you're used to this, like absolutely nothing wrong with this, but since this is added typically in the meatballs and then right as a garnish to the top of our pasta, it immediately kind of hits your tongue, hits your nose. So buying some Parmigiano Reggiano does make a significant difference and really make it feel a little bit more premium and much more enjoyable. That being said, you can honestly make spaghetti meatballs however you want to. Hopefully you realize that whether you go with all cheap ingredients, more high-end ingredients, or somewhere in between. Really knowing how to use those ingredients is just as important when it comes to making a great dish. But anyway, that's gonna wrap it up for me in this one. The grocery list as well as the recipe will be linked below if you guys wanna make some spaghetti meatballs. I'm excited because I've got a lot of leftovers now. And then also, let me know down in the comments what dishes you might wanna see next. I've got this idea for kind of a cheap or a budget versus a more premium cheesesteak, comparing maybe like a self-shaved prime ribeye versus some pre-shaved beef that I can get at the store. So I think that's gonna be a pretty interesting comparison. But anyway, that'll wrap it up for me in this one. I will catch you all in the next one. Peace, y'all.